Good afternoon and welcome to another Sweet Thursday program. Today with physician Dr. Suzanne Koven. Thank you for joining us on another Zoom webinar. Our next program is in 2 weeks on March 24th, also by Zoom. Today we're on Zoom webinar format, and unlike a Zoom meeting, we cannot see or hear any of you. Q&A is open for you to type your questions for our author, which we will take after the presentation. Please do not use the raise hand or chat functions. All of our recorded programs can be viewed on our YouTube channel. Sweet Thursday is the author series sponsored by the Friends of the Lafayette Library and Learning Center, which is the all-volunteer organization that sells gently used books in order to support the Lafayette Library. My name is Jeff Deeden, and I'll be tonight's moderator. We have several webinars coming up in the next few months, and when it seems prudent, we will actually resume in-person programs. On March 24th, Naomi Krupitsky will discuss her debut novel, The Family, about two young girls whose fathers worked for the Italian mafia in Brooklyn in mid-20th century. On April 7th, Dave Zirin will discuss the world of sports activism as described in his book, The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World. And on May 12th, Marion Nessel will share secrets of food research and marketing in her book, Unsavory Truth, How Food Companies Skew the Science of What We Eat. Our next Wonder of the World program will be on April 13th, when a docent from the DeYoung Museum via Zoom will discuss their exhibition, Alice Neal, People Come First. Note that this program will not be recorded. As I mentioned, you can either rewatch, or if you missed the program, watch our programs on our YouTube channel. In order to learn about more library programming, you can sign up for our weekly ad lib emails, which look like this, and describe upcoming events, including those hosted by the Foundation and the County Library System. In order to do that, you can sign up on llcf.org/subscribe. And to get even more programming, you can sign up, go on to the county site where you'll get programming information from other branches, and playing with the different tabs, you can find all kinds of things. The Friends Corner Bookshop sells inexpensive, gently used books that support a number of programs shown here and services at the library. The Friends Amazon store, selling higher value books, can be accessed via the Friends tab on the library website. Once again, we thank the Friends, the Lafayette Library staff, the Library Foundation, and my Sweet Thursday committee members, Ruthie and Robin. Suzanne's book can be purchased at Arinda Books, and you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Today's author is a physician and writer from Boston, Dr. Suzanne Koven. In 2017, she wrote a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine titled Letter to a Young Female Physician. In it, she recalled how she'd been asked to participate in an orientation exercise for new interns in which they all wrote letters to themselves about their hopes and anxieties for the upcoming year, to be opened 6 months later. As these interns wrote, she composed a letter of her own to her younger self. She warns herself about long hours, sexism, and especially the self-doubt of the imposter syndrome. She advises herself to appreciate the things that her patients appreciate in her, and to have both confidence but also humility during the pursuit of the noble path of physician. That letter became the nidus for the book we'll discuss today. Dr. Koven was born and raised in New York City. She received her BA in English Literature from Yale and her MD from Johns Hopkins. After a residency in internal medicine at Johns Hopkins Hospital, she joined the faculty at the Harvard Medical School and has practiced primary care at Mass General Hospital in Boston for over 30 years. She has a master's in fine arts in nonfiction. Her essays, articles, blogs, reviews have appeared in numerous publications. In 2019, she was named inaugural writer in residence at Mass General. She conducts workshops, moderates panel discussions, and speaks to a variety of audiences about literature and medicine, narrative and storytelling in medicine, women's health, mental health care, primary care, and directs the Media and Medicine Certificate Program at Harvard Medical School. Okay. All right, Suzanne, you can come on in a sec. Welcome to the Lafayette Library and Learning Center. I probably ought to show myself. Thank you for joining us today to share your story and insights. This book resonated with me, a retired physician, in a way that's going to sound a little selfish, but as I've reflected on a lot of the points in your book, I've refined a lecture I'm going to be giving in September at a medical conference that I've titled The Blind Side, Confessions of a Retired Interventional Radiologist. Therefore, I'm eager to share your story with our audience. So why don't you tell us how this letter morphed into a book and expound upon it?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, and greetings from still slightly snowy Boston. As you mentioned, Jeff, this book grew out of an essay, and the essay grew out really of a single moment. And I do a lot of coaching of other writers, particularly healthcare workers who are interested in writing, of which there are many. And the best piece of writing advice I know is that when a moment just strikes you by surprise in some way, whether you find yourself surprised by being moved or amused or angered, that is probably fertile territory to explore in writing. And that's what happened that day in late June of 2016, just about 30 years to the day after I started my own internship, when I participated in that exercise. And what happened was I looked around the room, at the conference table, at these incoming medical interns. I noticed that more than half of them were women. I saw them earnestly hunched over their letters, writing to their future selves. And all of a sudden, I was moved almost to tears. And I thought, wow, what is that? Where is this coming from? And I'd been writing long enough at this point to know that the only way for me to find out would be to write myself. So I wrote, and I realized that what I wanted to tell myself 30 years earlier was a little bit about what would be in store for me. Sad to say, the gender equity gap in medicine in terms of pay, academic promotion, research grant funding, harassment, and parental leave, and many other parameters hasn't budged a whole lot over the decades. There are more women entering medicine, but there's still a tremendous gender gap. But what I really wanted to tell myself was not to waste so much time worrying about not belonging in the profession, about being a fraud. And it was only as I wrote this that I realized the extent to which this concern had preoccupied me. So I wrote this thing and I thought, well, I guess there'll be a few young female physicians out there to whom this will be reassuring. Um, but it kind of went a little viral, or I guess as viral as anything in the New England Journal of Medicine does, unless it's a new discovery. And I started hearing from people all over the world, and not just young female physicians. It got picked up by the lay press. It was featured on Bloomberg and Time Magazine and Fortune, and really kind of picked up as a workplace phenomenon. So I was approached by an editor who wanted to know if I wanted to write a book of essays like that one. And I said no. And the reason I said no is that, and I think this is not uncommon for authors to say, is that I was so busy thinking I was writing a different book that I didn't really see the book that was in front of me. The book I thought I was writing and had been writing at that point for a couple of years and getting not very far with was a memoir about having completely missed the diagnosis of my own mother's heart disease. She was diagnosed with a massive myocardial infarction in my emergency room by my colleagues. That was, a painful and dramatic um, experience. And I thought I would write a memoir about it, about women and heart disease, about my relationship with my mother, about, the dual roles of doctor and daughter. But as I say, I was sort of spinning my wheels and writing a lot of pages, but somehow it wasn't coming together. Anyway, I banged my head against that wall for another year, and then I went back to this editor, and I realized that my mother and her heart disease would be in this, but that it would merely be an episode within what would turn out to be a series of essays about my life in medicine, starting from when I was a young child growing up in a home where my dad was a doctor. He was an orthopedic surgeon in private practice. My initial, I know people kind of like inside baseball stuff about writing. I know I do. My initial draft that I sent to an agent was about 500 pages. And what the agent told me, what the editor subsequently told me, what my husband actually had told me a couple of years earlier, was that this really was a book about medicine, and that anything about it that wasn't about medicine was going to have to go on the cutting room floor. And I really resisted that, but um, but I ended up following that advice, and it was good advice. So that, yes, I write about my parents and my kids, and um, and all sorts of personal stuff about myself, but always kind of through this lens of medicine and my trajectory through a childhood colored by medicine, medical training, medical practice, and then at this point, um, you know, being a patient myself, being the family member of patients. So, um, another thing I would like to say, and then I'll read you a little bit of it that'll give you a sense of it, is that, for those of you who are interested in doing any kind of personal writing, personal essay, memoir, journaling, a great pleasure of this activity, whether you want to publish or not, is that you really do rediscover your own life in a new way. All of us kind of walk around with a set of tapes in our heads. We know why we live where we live, and we have a little story that goes with that. We know why our partner is our partner, and we know why we're in a particular job. And these, these tapes are pretty static, I think, for the most part. If we met someone at a cocktail party and they asked us, why do you live here? We know what the answer is. We're not surprised by our own answer. But when you sort of start taking these stories to the page, you're surprised. You say to yourself, wait a minute, I did what? I thought, what? This thing happened 6 months after that thing? How did I not notice that? And this happened to me time and time again. Situations in which, for example, I was exposed to pretty extreme sexism that I was oblivious to. And then that occasioned my asking myself, well, why would that have been? Why was I so oblivious to it? And then, of course, as I said at the beginning, I kind of wrote into the answer. Well, one of the questions I asked myself as I was writing this was, why did I become a doctor in the first place? I mean, for one thing, I was not a very good science student or math, didn't like either of them. This isn't something that was sort of obvious for me to do. Why did I do that, and where did that begin? And so I wrote a little bit about that in the introduction to the book is the letter to which you referred. And then chapter 1 is called Risk Factors, which is what doctors say about, all the different things that kind of make you at risk for something happening down the road. I'm using the term, of course, in a different kind of way here. So let me just read a few snippets from that and give you a sense of it. In elementary school, my friend Lisa and I spent hours playing board games at her family's home or mine in the leafy Ditmas Park neighborhood of Brooklyn. Our favorite was Careers. Like Life, another game then popular, Careers aimed to instill in young baby boomers solid post-war American values. The goal was to select an occupation, doctor, lawyer, engineer, and so on, and accumulate victory points for fame, money, and happiness. Each player enjoyed distinct advantages. The engineer got extra points for landing on a particular square, and so forth, except the doctor. The only advantage to being the doctor was that you got to pretend you were a doctor. I always chose to be the doctor. It wasn't an obvious choice. My father was a doctor, and so were most of the men and the couples who made up my parents' social circle. But none of the women were, except one, a psychoanalyst who practiced from her home in a wheelchair. She'd been paralyzed by spinal anesthetic while giving birth. Once, when I was about 14, I asked my mother whose fault it was that this woman was paralyzed. Was it the obstetricians, the anesthesiologists? My mother said she supposed if you really thought about it, you could say her husband was to blame for her disability, since he had impregnated her. The word impregnated sounded painful to me, like a punishment. In the years when Lisa and I played Careers, I had a watch that came with patent leather bands in various colors that could be interchanged. In the 60s, everyone was mad for color, but the only band I ever wore was the white one. which I associated with being a doctor. I glanced at it as I moved my doctor-shaped piece around the careers board, admiring the bones in my wrist, a doctor's wrist, I thought. I hated wearing dresses, and especially loathed tights. In public school, girls were required to wear dresses, which meant for the most of the school year wearing tights. I dreaded going to school because I equated school with tights. They gripped, they itched, they were not me. I didn't want to be a man, but I didn't want to be a woman either, or what I thought a woman was, or what my mother was in my earliest memories of her in the years before she went to law school with her committees, her hats, and her boredom. It seemed so much easier to be a boy. Boys didn't wear tights. Boys didn't graduate from tights to garter belts to girdles that left red dents in their skin like the ones I saw on my mother's thighs each time she undressed. Things only got worse for girls. I'll stop there.
Okay. You're, the book does, I could tell you were conflicted, based on what you just told us, that you included many snippets of what you talked about your other book, personal things about your parents and things. So about your parents, you mentioned in the book that your father was an orthopedic surgeon and your mother raised your kids, your two older brothers and you, and yet at age 43, she decided to go to law school. So how did those two influences affect your career choice? I think in the book you might have mentioned that you didn't think you wanted to be a doctor at one point, but there
Well,
you
I
go.
mean, yeah. So, it was very complicated, you see, and again, I only realized this, so many decades later when I sat down to write about it. I think I must have wanted to be a doctor, but there were two problems. One, in my mind, doctors were men, and also people who went to medical school were good at math and science. So those seemed to me completely insurmountable. Of course, they weren't, neither was, but they seemed to me insurmountable. And it really wasn't until I graduated from college as an English major that I said, well, so wait a minute, maybe this thing that I've believed all these years actually isn't true. Um, in terms of my mother going to law school, uh, so she was 43 in 1970. This was a pretty bold thing that she did, to go to law school. She started law school right around the time I started um, high school or middle school, I guess. And I think that the influence was mostly sort of subliminal. I'll tell you one thing I took from it, which was that my mother was brilliant and ambitious, um, and was, if she had been born later, I think her trajectory would have been a little different. Um, but definitely the message I got from her was that it was okay to be ambitious as a woman as long as you also set a nice table. And as long as you um, kept up at the beauty parlor, which is what she called it, that that somehow these sort of womanly arts needed to be tended to, no matter how hard you worked and no matter how busy uh, you were. Now, of course, I grew up with the full benefit of second wave feminism, um, and yet, what's been so sort of interesting to me and somewhat alarming to me, as I've gone on this extensive Zoom book tour, in which I talked to a lot of young women, a lot of young female physicians, is that um, that particular sense of conflict has not been resolved, particularly um, regarding pregnancy and child rearing. We know, for example, in medicine, and I suspect if this study has been done among lawyers, engineers, or whatever, that the results would be the same. We know that in medicine, if a female physician has a physician male partner, she does 8.5 hours extra per week of childcare and housework over, more than her partner does. And women I've talked to around the country where, I was, telling them about being pregnant as a resident, and there being no maternity leave policy, and there being no accommodation for, late pregnancy in terms of work hours and so forth. And I thought the reaction to that would be, like, okay, boomer, or, gee, it must have really been bad back then in the dark ages. That isn't what I've heard from young women. What I've heard from young women is, yeah, it's still like that, which is pretty horrifying.
Yeah, you mentioned engineers and others. I think that medicine has a unique challenge, and I agree with you. When I um, came out of medical school and started practice, uh, the numbers. I think they're a third of my class was female. Now, every medical school in the country practically, well, the aggregate numbers are more than 50%. Um, and yet there are specialties that are hard to crack.
Mhm.
When I joined my group, this will point out the dichotomy of this whole thing. I was able, when a few years after I joined my group, I became the chief of my department, and we were able to hire spectacular candidates, female candidates, because other practices in the area wouldn't hire them for the reasons we're talking about, that they would go out and get pregnant, and they've had to put off their pregnancy through medical school, through internship. It's just so inconvenient to do that. And so, of course, when they finally get a job, and the stability that provides, they become pregnant. We just built that into our program. So on the one hand, our group was able to attract unbelievably great talent because they were shunned by others. And yet, when they became pregnant, they had to exhaust all their sick leave, they had to exhaust their vacation and all this stuff. And basically, to get 12 weeks, it was completely annihilated their whole ability to have time off in the future.
Right.
And you address, and I want you to explore this a little further, especially toward the end of the book, about your own personal, conflicts about becoming part-time. Most of my female partners were part-time because they wanted to try to have some work-life balance. They wanted to be mothers. They wanted to participate in the child rearing. And you talk about all the guilt that's associated, and you can talk about that paper that you quote about the anesthesiologist with 4 kids. It's a tough deal, and I can't imagine the stress of a mother physician.
Mhm. Well, sure you can, because you were a father physician. So I think that's one of the problems I think we have with these conversations is is one of the things we sort of accept at baseline is that this is a woman's problem. It's not a woman's problem. It's everybody's problem, and the way that we've organized things, I think, hurts men as much as it does women. In terms of what's unique, I think, about medicine is that, and this is a noble thing and a thing that I'm proud of. We have an ethos of, self-sacrifice, that your feelings don't matter, the patient's feelings matter. And, you stay up all night, because patients need you. Um, you go through this brutal training. You basically miss your 20s. I used to joke that if a celebrity had died while I was in training, I didn't know about it till decades later because you just were oblivious. Um, and I think that's noble and good. I don't think it has to be as brutal as it is, or certainly as brutal as it was. Uh, and and there's a price to be paid for that, not least of which is the fact that physicians have much higher suicide rates than the general population, and women physicians have even higher suicide rates than male physicians. So, so what does it feel then to step back, as I did? After I'd had my second child, I had been in practice a couple of years. I had envisioned myself as the infinitely available physician. That's who I thought, I wanted to be. That's what I thought a good physician was. One of my older colleagues had advised me when I first started in practice that the three qualities that patients wanted in their primary care physician was accessibility, accessibility, and accessibility. And and I found that I just couldn't do it. Uh, and um, and so I cut back. The other thing, and I was lucky to do it. Many people who would like to do it can't do it for all kinds of reasons, not least of which is just, economic viability. But another part, I think, of the medical ethos is this value on being a team player, of not burdening your colleagues. I think that's a wonderful thing, and I've benefited from it, but it goes too far. I mean, if a woman in 2022 feels that taking maternity leave is burdening her colleagues, there's something really wrong with that. We also know, by the way, that female physicians now in 2022 have higher rates of fetal loss, higher rates of pregnancy complication, higher rates of infertility than women in general because of deferred childbearing and overwork, and so forth. And that's just all kinds of wrong. In terms of working part-time, it was the right decision for me. As I say, I was grateful to have made it. Um, but it was pretty emotionally, psychologically freighted. Uh, I felt like, well, am I really a doctor now? If I'm not accessible. And years after I did it, I mean, I was well into practice. My kids were at this point, I think, just about all out of the house. An op-ed appeared in the New York Times by a female physician, an anesthesiologist out, I think, in LA, who had 4 kids, and who argued that if you're a woman physician who works part-time, you're letting down your patients, your colleagues, and the government, which has subsidized in part your medical education. To add insult to injury, the accompanying sort of cartoon illustration was of a sort of physician Barbie. Uh, she was reading an X-ray and vacuuming a rug in high heels, and I think the rug was zebra patterned, and there was a kid in a high chair in the background. It's really pretty terrible. Um, I was so infuriated with this that I actually wrote a response op-ed in the Boston Globe saying that, well, all patients are full-time patients and all doctors are part-time doctors. And that, in fact, at that point, this was 2011, it may still be true, I think it is, the fastest growing subset of physicians who were going to part-time was older men. Um, so, um, so yeah, I think it's particularly complicated, I think, for medicine. Um, but I think this resonates across the board, and it's not just a woman's issue.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about your writing.
Yeah.
You added writing and teaching along the way. And the way I read your career, and you can correct me because this is just one interpretation, it seemed kind of linear, that you you did your education, and then you got into practice, and then you described a period of therapy, and then when you were done with that, you had time to start a Harvard extension course and completed a master's for that, and then you started your MFA program in writing, and then you started the Med Lit program. So all along, it seems like once you were established, I'm not going to say it's not accurate, but it was like medicine wasn't the complete Dr. Koven. You needed something else, and maybe
Yeah,
it goes back to your undergraduate degree, or and maybe you can weave in how your parents encouraged and your reading habits at a young age. Just talk about reading and writing and all
sure.
that.
Well, yeah, I have to sort of chuckle when you use the term linear because it makes it all sound so intentional. The fact of the matter is that uh, it was all very unintentional and unplanned. It wasn't willy-nilly, but I like to think of myself as I'd like to be the patron saint of late bloomers. I was late to medical school, late to graduate school, late to publish, late to a writing career. Um, and uh, I think that it was a little bit of a Goldilocks approach. It was, well, I have this sort of inkling that I want this, but no, not quite that, but not quite that. Oh, this, maybe this. And it took me a long time to get to it. So, those of you who are listening and you think the ship already sailed, let me assure you that it hasn't. In terms of writing, I certainly mentor incredible young writers who are publishing at all of your dream places, in their 20s. That wasn't me. Uh, so I think the way it went for me was this, and along the way, a lot of wrong-headed thinking, and a lot of, I kissed a lot of frogs along the way too, made a lot of wrong turns. So this is sort of the narrative I would reconstruct based on this, which is a lot less admirable than the one. I like yours better, but this is actually what happened. So I um, I was not a great reader as a kid. I was sort of a pretend reader. I just read Catcher in the Rye, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and To Kill a Mockingbird over and over and over and over again. Um, and I really didn't discover the true pleasure of reading until I was well into college, and I was an English major. So it wasn't really till pretty late that I discovered the true pleasure of reading. Um, Once I decided to go to medical school, I thought, well, okay, you can either be a humanities kind of person who likes to read, or you can be a science and medicine person who likes that stuff, and you can't be both. And I've cast my lot in with medicine, so I guess that's what I'm doing now. And I guess I'm not a reading humanities person anymore. Well, that was really dumb because, after all, Apollo was the god of both medicine and poetry. We know that there have been many and are many, many more now, doctor writers. I've basically built a whole career on the premise that storytelling is the fundamental, fundamental principle of medicine. Uh, but, then at the age of, in my 20s, um, I just thought, well, I guess I can't be this because I'm that. And I think as we form our identities, we sometimes have dumb ideas like that, like it's the way we organize our thoughts about who we are. Well, I guess I'm not that, so I must be that. Anyway, years went by, years of medical training and having babies and starting a practice and all that stuff. And then it wasn't until my 40s that I looked around and I thought, well, wait a minute, what about that? What about that whole reading and writing thing? What about that? And I started trekking over um, to Harvard Square across the Charles River after work and taking writing courses and literature courses. And I did that for years as sort of a secret hobby. I never imagined that it would somehow become part of my career. I just knew that I wanted to do it. It's like, some people garden and some people, work on cars. My hobby in middle age was I wrote English papers, which may seem very strange. It seems a bit strange to me in retrospect. And then I just started loving writing more and more. I started my MFA program at 52 and I published my book at 64. So it was not exactly the fast track. One thing you said that I think is really true is that there was, even though I loved medicine, love it still, there was always this feeling that I wanted like something else professionally. I didn't know what it was. And so when I started working part time, when my kids were very little, I think the assumption of my colleagues was, well, her kids will go off to school and then she'll come back full time. I didn't think I would do that. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what that something was. And there were years and years and years of countless car rides and hikes when, I would be talking to my husband about this thing I wanted to do that I couldn't put my finger on, I couldn't name. And then when I figured out it was writing, there were years and years and years when I thought, I want to write, I want to write, I want to write. I would go to bookstores, I would fantasize my book on the shelves. I want to write, I want to write, I want to write. And then finally, he gave me very good advice and he said, look, you know how to go to school. So why don't you go to school and see what happens? And
Oh,
that was great advice because I am somebody, I suspect many people listening are, certainly most doctors are. I'm very task oriented. I'm very assignment responsive. I'm very deadline responsive. And all I had to do was enroll in a class, and boy, I started producing. And now that I'm no longer in school, the editor has replaced the teacher, but I still write when I owe somebody writing. I don't get up and journal. I don't write 1,000 words a day. I don't do any of that. I write when I have to write, and I have to write when I've told someone that they're going to receive writing from me.
Wow. Some of that stuff really resonates with me. I was definitely, a science guy. Um, and in fact, in my undergraduate, I took everything you could take by the end of my third year. And I said, and I kind of inversed my whole education. And I finally did all this general ed, quote unquote, the humanities side in my fourth year of undergraduate, and finally appreciated some of those things, music and and literature and history and things. And then in practice, I'd never allowed, I mean, I read 3 books a year. I mean, that was kind of my average. I was always just journals. And so this is touching on that part of your book, but also about the whole imposter syndrome. I always was a little insecure about my knowledge base. And so I had to always, that my free time, that I allowed for reading, I was doing in journals. Um, and my dad was the one that is caused me the most angst in recent years about this. He would always, and other people, recommend these books, and I go, I don't have time for that. I don't have time for that. And then in 2015, he died. In 2016, I retired. And then I joined a book club and I started in this role. And now I'm reading a bunch, not compared to a lot of people. And I have a couple ideas for books and all this stuff. And I feel like I completely missed the boat. I never got to have all these conversations with my father and other people about books until 6 years ago. And so I would just emphasize that the point you make in the book is you can do more than one thing, and there's a lot of ways to do it. And I just was fascinated by the fact that you kept doing all this stuff, that your different writing classes for years and years and years, while you were practicing.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting how, everybody has stuff that they're ashamed of, and everybody has um, regrets, and they're all so sort of secret and private, and take up enormous space in our minds. Um, and my mother used to say that there are certain there are certain problems that get solved in 10 years plus 10 minutes. And what she meant by that is you sort of you ruminate over something, and it sort of expands in your brain, over sometimes over years and years and years. Um, and then sometimes a single conversation, signing up for a course, and then all of a sudden, you're there. You are, you're you're doing it, and it turns out that it wasn't so late. So that's great.
Yeah. Um, I want to mention something to those on this webinar. Um, while I read books for this, when I'm going to moderate, I take notes. And one of the questions I wrote down was, because you refer to multiple books, being a English major and a writer, you make analogies and reference a whole bunch of different books. And I'm writing these down. And then so I wrote, one of my questions for you is, do you have a reading list for physicians, or I guess anybody,
Yes,
and of course, then I go on your website doing,
and there it
to try
is.
to do your introduction. You have this amazing, massive list in all different categories that
Yep.
I'm going to refer to for years to come. It was funny. I started looking for certain books. I wonder if she had this one. And anyway,
Yeah.
it's a
So
great
that's
list. So if anybody wants to check out, go to her website.
Yeah,
And
it's under links. So that is so the monthly literature and medicine group that I've been running at Mass General now, I guess for about 13 years. That is a list of every essay, play, novel, um, article, um, nonfiction book, uh, podcast, film that we've discussed in the last 13 years. So it's definitely keep you busy for a while.
It's got some old stuff, and I was surprised you had The Great Believers, which is a relatively recent book. All kinds of really, it just spreads lots of genres. It's a great list.
Mhm.
Anyway, how are we doing on time? All right, I think we got about 5 more minutes. Um, you early in the book you talk about your training, and we
Mhm.
all anybody's gone through an internship and residency has stories, and we don't have to spend a lot of time. But you reference The House of God,
Mhm.
which is a book that I read, and we consider it kind of a Bible. It's a condemnation basically of what interns get put through.
Mhm.
Um, and like you, I found it more of as a guide rather than as what not to do. It's what a lot of us get through, but it's really a perverse take on things. It ought not to be a guide. It's got a lot of
Mhm.
you know nasty references to types of patients and things like that.
And
Um,
incredibly sexist, by the way.
yes, yes.
Mhm.
Anyway, I guess there's no question there. But if you had a comment on that, um,
Well, I think it just speaks to something I was saying before that you sort of re-examine some of this stuff in retrospect, and you realize that you you were oblivious to things that you shouldn't have been oblivious to. Uh, for example, that House of God came out, was published in 1978. I started my internship in 1986. It was vocabulary from that book, which, for those of you who don't know, it is a kind of very sort of dark humor, um, lightly fictionalized account of this physician's internship, published under a pseudonym, and in which there are sort of derogatory nicknames for patients and so forth. It was written as satire and as a condemnation of this inhumane system that made young doctors feel so hostile to their patients. Um, but that's not how we took it. We took it as sort of a guide of how to be a smartass and a badass. We didn't use that term then, but that's what we wanted to be. And particularly as a woman, I think I should have questioned that more, but I didn't. I think this is sort of the last point I'll make. I think you want to go to the Q&A, but one of the things I've thought about a lot is, this wasn't that long ago. This wasn't pre-feminism. I knew all about feminism. I was in a consciousness raising group in high school in the 70s. So it wasn't like, well, of course you didn't think about, sexism and feminism because this was such a long time ago. It wasn't that. We talked about it in high school. We talked about it in college, and then in medical school and residency, the conversation stopped. And I think it was because we were working so hard, and also I think more so, because we were struggling to stay accepted in a system that was fundamentally hostile to us. Um, while I was writing the book, I reignited a friendship with a residency mate who is Black, and I raised this point to him. I said, how could I have been so enamored of a system that was so hostile to me? Um, and he said that I had kind of gotten it wrong, that it wasn't that the system was hostile to me. He said they loved you and they loved me too, as a young Black doctor. but we kind of knew that it wouldn't take much for us to, be on the outs, and that we felt we had to be perfect and not make any trouble in order to remain accepted and to thrive. And I think he was right about that.
Hmm.
And I think he's still right about it.
Yeah. Hmm. Okay, let's pull a question here. Please discuss how the imposter syndrome impacted you. It seems to be more common than one would expect.
Sure. Well, so imposter, it's a great question, and it's a very common, and not just among women, certainly not just among physicians. Um, so imposter syndrome was first described in the 70s. So that term existed by the time I got to medical school, though I had never heard it. But my best friend in medical school and I called ourselves the asterisks, as in asterisk, we got into medical school, but there probably weren't that many applicants that year. And uh, and I think that that's pretty typical. It's sort of like every every achievement, every promotion, every evidence that you have that you're pretty okay, you somehow qualify with a but. Like, well, I'm in this job, but I'm the least competent person here, or I snowed him at the interview, or something like that. And the way it affected me was, I think that I think that I thought I had to be perfect, because somehow if you're not perfect, you're a fraud, which of course is ridiculous, but it took me a few decades to figure that out. And it also, and I talked about this in the original letter that appears in the book. It sometimes made me make choices that were the wrong choices, simply so that I could prove to myself and others that I wasn't a fraud. So, choosing to apply for a training in a particular specialty that I wasn't even that interested in, just because I think there was a voice in my head that said, well, if you're someone who knows how to like do a lot of stuff, do a lot of procedures, no one will ever question your competence. Um, and you know, and also, I think it creates sort of a sense of isolation. I think it's so common, particularly, maybe particularly for women. This is certainly what I hear, that you're sitting at you're standing around a bedside, you're sitting in an auditorium, you're sitting around a conference table, and you're thinking, I am the only one here who doesn't know a lot of stuff. And that is a very isolating, very bad feeling. Um, I need to mention that that a lot of imposter syndrome is undoubtedly internalized sexism. For people of color, internalized racism, etc. I got a lot of mail from female physicians of color, saying, yeah, of course I feel like an imposter. I get told in large and small ways all day, every day, that I'm not good enough and I don't belong here. Why wouldn't I feel like that?
Yeah, I think that gets internalized by society, and we start believing it. It's conditioning. Um, you wrote, this is me again. When I talk with my patients about issues not strictly medical, I feel most like a doctor.
Mm.
And yet, in another chapter, you point out that you don't socialize with your patients. You have a professional line that you don't cross. You don't
Mhm.
discuss personal things with them. I was wondering how those two superficially
Yeah,
incongruous things might actually make sense.
that's a really great observation. So, I, you know, every every physician, therapist, etc., figures out what sort of the right balance between professionalism, intimacy is with their patient, client, etc. And I think it's different for different people. I have colleagues who play golf with their patients. Um, I have colleagues who socialize with their patients, who are friends on social media with their patients, and so forth. um, and then I have patients who, in the exam room, never reveal anything about themselves and, never talk about anything other than, the medical problem at hand. For me, my comfort zone, and it took me, I mean, practice a long time to evolve it, is that I um, I don't play golf with my patient. Well, I don't play golf at all, but I don't socialize with my patients. I'm not friends with my patients on social media for the most part. Um, but in the exam room, I sort of play, I feel most comfortable right at the edge of what you wouldn't think would be quite medical because I feel, and I'm a primary care doctor, I'm not a subspecialist, although I think there are some wonderful subspecialists who do this too. I feel like if a patient comes to me and they're stressed, and what's stressing them is that their mom's in a nursing home and they hate visiting because it's so horribly depressing, but they feel so guilty when they don't visit. I mean, is that a medical problem? And if I am discussing it with them, am I discussing it with them as a doctor, or am I discussing it with them as a middle-aged woman, who had parents who failed and died, and about whom, I had all kinds of feelings, including guilt. Um, and I think the answer is both, but the part of the job I've always liked best is the part where I'm really bringing myself to the question, myself as a doctor, myself as a mom, myself as a woman, myself as a reader, as a writer, etc. Um, but the gold standard is it always has to be in the service of the patient. If it's, in the exam room or at the hospital bedside, if you're just sort of exercising your own ego, um, and the patient just happens to be there, then that's that kind of self-revelation, that kind of intimacy, is really, I think, against our creed, and is not okay. I'm sure I've done it plenty of times, um, but I've regretted it.
Well, I've got several more questions. I think our audience has had theirs answered. I want to just close with one thing. This cracked me up when you said it. That one time you were accused of plagiarism because what you had written was too good.
Mhm.
How did you perceive that?
Well, again, I sound like a broken record. Well, there's a dated reference. Um, but I'll tell you how I perceived it at the time, and then I'll tell you how I perceived it 40 years later when I wrote about it. How I perceived it at the time was, uh-oh, I got accused of plagiarism by this guy. I was going to ask for a med school recommendation. My goose is cooked. I'm not going to get a recommendation. I'm not going to get into medical school. This is a disaster. Oh, and also, you know, um, no, I didn't plagiarize, and and please take that back because it's wrong. And amazingly, he did. He said, "Oh, okay, I guess I'm wrong." 40 years later, I'm writing about it. And it was actually my literary agent was reading the draft and of this anecdote. And she said, you do realize that if you had been a male student, the teacher never would have accused you of plagiarizing something because it was too good. 40 years, that thought had never occurred to me. And of course, she was right. And yet, at the time, I had been blind to it. And then, as I say, going back and interrogating the facts of your own life, I mean, really is, in some sense, it's this is how psychotherapy works, right? You're interrogating the facts of your own life and discovering all these fascinating things that are really hiding in plain sight.
Well, this has been a lot of fun for me. I'm going to buy some plane tickets to Boston and enroll in your MedLit class. Come out there and
Oh,
share some
please
of these
do.
things.
Please do. You'll love the weather.
Um, but thank you so much for appearing with us. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you for taking the time.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, everyone, for listening in.
Okay, don't forget to check out her website, everybody. All right, take care, Suzanne.
Good night.
Hey,
Bye.
wonderful.
Very nice. Good project.
Is that off?